Over the course of these videos, we're going to travel right the way across the world, from La Scala in Milan to the Australian outback. However, this particular video starts in my kitchen with an empty ice cream tub and an elastic band. I'm going to start by stretching the rubber band around the ice cream tub. Within 30 seconds, I've just created a really simple string instrument. If I pluck the rubber band, the twanging sound isn't all that appealing. But this design forms the basis of all stringed instruments, and stringed instruments can be found all over the world. Most of us have seen violins, violas, cellos and double basses that originated from Europe. But then there's also the banjo that we find in the United States, the oud, which is used in a huge amount of North African music, and the erhu, a kind of Chinese version of the violin. Their design is essentially the same. When a string is pulled tight like this, it adopts some interesting properties. When we pluck the string, it vibrates back and forth, and this is the basis of the way all string instruments produce their sound. On their own, these vibrations are probably not very useful to us, as they're too quiet. That's why almost all string instruments come with a resonator. It's this box and the air within it that helps to amplify the sound of the vibrating string. We can see this in action on Catherine's cello. The strings are pulled tightly from the top of the instrument to the bottom. When the strings are played, the vibrations are passed via this wooden bridge to the resonating body of the cello. There are three things that affect what pitch a particular string will sound at. Firstly, how thick it is. You'll notice that the strings towards the bottom of this cello are thicker than those towards the top. The second thing is how long the string is. On this instrument, you'll see that all the strings are approximately the same length. Thirdly, the pitch of these strings is also affected by how much tension or how tight these strings are. At the top of the cello, you'll see some pegs. The player uses those pegs to change the amount of tension in the strings, and thereby change the note that they're tuned to. On a cello, these notes are C, G, D, and A. All of these things are important to the pitch of a string because they all change the speed at which the string vibrates. We've already learned that the faster something is vibrating, the higher the note it produces. Now, if we were to try and play all the music on the cello with just these four open strings, I think things would quickly become quite boring. Can you imagine trying to write a piece that only used four notes? So, to give the player and the composer more options, string players also use their fingers to change the length of the strings. By pressing down on the string in this way, you shorten the length, and therefore make the pitch of this string slightly higher. On some instruments like lutes and guitars and banjos, the player is helped out by having something called frets. The frets help to mark out the different lengths of strings that we need to produce the various notes. So when we press down in between the frets, it's not actually our finger that's making the string shorter. Instead, the string presses against the next fret up. This makes it much easier to play these fretted instruments because the instrument takes care of the tuning. For violin, viola, cello and double bass players, however, their instruments don't have frets, so they have to spend years learning exactly where to put their fingers down to be able to play the notes that they want. A lot of this involves developing really good listening skills to hear if the notes they've produced are in tune or not. Stringed instruments are used in a huge amount of Western music. Bach wrote numerous cello suites, and that's what Catherine's playing right now. But also, the Beatles used a fantastic string arrangement on their song Eleanor Rigby. So let's explore the family of Western string instruments in a little more detail. First of all, let's start by having a look at the instruments of the viol family. Viols were some of the first stringed instruments to be used in Western classical music. For a long time they had no fixed size, and different sizes existed to cover the various ranges of pitches that composers wanted to write for. However, over time these viols developed and changed their design, and certain standards started to emerge. These standards became the violin, viola, cello and double bass that we're used to seeing in orchestras today. Perhaps the most interesting thing about this family of instruments is the way that they're played. How exactly does it work that when the violin bow is moved across the string, the beautiful sustained singing tone is produced? The secret is in the hair that is used on the bow. Back in history, this used to be taken from horses' tails. If we were to look at this horsehair under a microscope, we would see that it was a really rough surface. Pulling this rough surface across the strings of a violin, viola, cello or double bass is very similar to plucking it thousands of times a second. Using the bow, the player is able to produce long, sustained notes in addition to very fast playing. But there are also other techniques that players can use to get other sounds out of stringed instruments just like this. One of these is pizzicato. When a string player is told to play pizzicato, this means that the composer wants that player to pluck the strings instead of using their bow. Pizzicato playing is fantastic for incredibly rhythmic, exciting playing. A really good example of this is in Tchaikovsky's Fourth Symphony, an example I might give you at the end of this video. Another technique is tremolando, which asks the player to shake their bow really fast, normally towards the point of the bow. This produces a dramatic effect which is often used in operas and film scores. Finally, a more unusual effect is to use the stringed instruments as percussion instruments, rejecting the hair for the wooden part of the bow. While some composers write for solo string instruments, most of the time we find these instruments playing in sections of maybe 5 or more players. And it's sections of string players, just like this one, which we can find in the orchestra. Another stringed instrument that you'll find in an orchestra is the harp. The harp is a really beautiful instrument, and it's really easy to recognise it from miles away. Unlike the stringed instruments that we've seen so far, the harp has one string for every note the player needs to play. This makes it fantastic for glissandos. Glissandos is where the player glides over the notes in quick succession. In TV and movie soundtracks, harp glissandos are often used when a character is entering a dream or a flashback. Finally, let's have a look at the guitar. While we're all very used to seeing electric guitars in rock and pop bands, acoustic guitars have been around for over 1,000 years. That's quite a lot longer than most of the other stringed instruments that we've seen so far. During the Renaissance period, the guitar and its close relative the lute were popular choices among a group of musicians called troubadours. Troubadours were almost like the original singer-songwriters, going from town to town performing songs that they'd written. During the 18th and 19th centuries, the guitar went through something of a decline in popularity. During this period, composers write for the guitar less and less, focusing their attention on other stringed instruments. However, the invention of the electric guitar in the 20th century was a really important turning point in the development of popular music. The invention of electric instruments like these led to a fundamental change in the types of ensembles being used by composers and songwriters. There are several different techniques to play the guitar. Some players choose to use a finger-picking style, which means that they pluck the strings with their fingers. This is very common in folk music. Other players choose to use what is called a plectrum, which allows them to strum the strings. This is particularly good for people playing chords on the guitar. The guitar is the most popular instrument in 2011 for people to learn. This is probably because it's so commonly used in so much of the music that most people really love. And that brings us to the end of this introduction to stringed instruments. Let's go and have a look at some of these in action.